So now we're going to talk a little bit more in detail about these contracts that we can create within ACI. So remember, if we have multiple endpoint groups, we have to have contracts in place in order to facilitate the communication between those different groups. So what we're going to find ourselves doing is creating usually a lot of different contracts. You could be lazy, you could be that guy, right, who goes out there and says, I'm just going to create a permit all contract and just let everyone use it, right? Yeah, that's the equivalent of going out there and putting in access list with a IP permit any and just letting shit fly, right? We're typically not gonna do that within ACI because that goes against everything ACI was really created for. So what we're gonna do, and let me zoom in here. We have these different EPGs that we're using here: database EPG, app EPG, web EPG. So what we're going to do is we're going to create these things called contracts between these guys. And these are going to have, again, things like, it's almost ACL-orific, right? Because we have permit statements for specific TCP protocols, IP, we can do ICMP, basically everything, right? We can do permit or deny specific traffic. Now, for the most part, as we write these contracts and the filters kind of contained therein, the filters are basically permit statements, okay? So we're going to permit what traffic we want to occur or we want to allow between these differing EPGs. So again, this is going to be basically a provider-consumer relationship where some of these guys are going to provide services while others are going to consume services. So we could, for instance, have a contract in place over here. We may have a specific name called, maybe this guy is going to be DB to app, and maybe we allow port like 8888 between these two. So basically we're providing services on maybe TCP port 8888 from this guy to this guy. And that's all that's allowed to communicate between them. So no matter what endpoints, what subnets, what MAC addresses these endpoints have, this is the port that we're allowing communication from this guy. So again, you can write it to where you allow bidirectional communication on that port, or you could just come in and say, only port 8888, right, is allowed to communicate with any port on this side. And that's what that contract basically does. Now over here from, say, app to web server, maybe we wanted to provide specific services on, UDP port, 21, right? Only in this direction. We would write a filter in place on this contract only allowing UDP port 21 to flow between those two hosts. And again, you can specify source and destination ports. You can allow bidirectional traffic within those contracts. They're pretty flexible at this point in time, okay? But you have to have contracts in place in order to allow that communication to occur between those different EPGs. Now, subjects are a part of these contracts, and subjects are typically going to be referencing apps or, like I say here, sub-applications. So you could have a contract with a bunch of different subjects for each service that you're going to be providing. Say you're providing port 80, port 443, FTP service, SSH service on port 22. You could have all of those as a single subject, or we could actually, if the way you want to kind of go, we could put these all in one big subject, and you could call it like web services, right? And that's perfectly doable. Most people choose to be pretty granular within here because if we ever want to delete something, we just go out there and say, hey, I just want to remove that subject from that contract and kind of be done with it. But we do have the flexibility. Typically people do, 1, 2, 3, and maybe 4 different subjects within their individual contracts. Now, multiple subjects can exist within those same contracts, and again, they're going to be used in a provider-consumer relationship. To kind of show you guys a little bit more about what we can do within these subjects is these are where we actually write these things called filters. So the filter is going to look a little bit something like this, and here I have a subject HTTP in here. And notice what I'm doing is I've got, basically a name for the filter. This is my permit HTTP filter, and then a name for the specific line. This can be numeric, it can be alphanumeric, but basically we're allowing IP on TCP, and then we're saying from any port to port 80 only, right? You could do a range of ports within here. Again, they are pretty stinking flexible in what you can do. But this specific subject I wrote, so this subject is called subject HTTP, and then the filter itself is just permit HTTP. Okay. Now the filter, this is kind of cool about the filter, and we'll see this in action here in a minute, is the filter is going to be stored within our tenant configuration. So we'll be able to reuse this filter in other subjects. So if I come in here, maybe I create another contract, up here, and maybe this contract I have a subject that is called, web services. Basically, I can come back and reuse this permit HTTP filter at a later time. I can just come in here and reference it. Okay, it's not bound to only the initial contract that we used it in. So again, these filters are really reusable things that we can basically leverage over and over and over again. Now, what you'll see a lot of people doing is they build a ton of filters under what we call that common tenant. And you're actually, when we get in to ACI here in a little bit, we're going to see that within the common tenant, there are some default templates for filters that we can use. I think they have one named default. I know they have one named ICMP, but basically they have a couple pre-done filters that any tenant can leverage. So I've seen a lot of people go in there and they just add all their default filters to the common tenant. So all the basic services, HTTP, HTTPS, they put in the common tenant, and then any tenant we build within ACI has the ability to go in there and use those guys at that point, right? So again, filters are basically ACLs containing ACEs, right? This is going to be the equivalent of our ACL, and this is going to be the equivalent of our access control entry itself. Again, they're basically permit statements. We're not saying deny this traffic, we're leveraging these for permits. Now, we do have the ability to use MAC addresses, IP addresses, layer 4 header information. Again, you're seeing part of that in here, and then port numbers within these statements. And I get a lot of questions from students who are like, okay, Jason, so these filters are basically permit statements. What if we have something we want to deny? What do we do there? Well, in that specific case, you're going to end up using something called a taboo contract. And these taboo contracts are basically disallow lists. These policies are basically for people who are moving from sort of a blacklist model where you say, I never want HTTP traffic to flow within my network. Well, in that case, if you're not to that point where you can do a whitelisting model like we're doing with regular contract subjects and filters where we're saying permit this, permit this, permit this, if you have something that needs to be denied all the time, you need to go ahead and create a taboo contract, okay? And then you're going to apply that to your actual EPGs themselves. So this taboo contract that I have, I'm actually using that filter HTTP traffic filter, right? Or actually that's my subject, right? And then it's referencing a filter for TCP. But basically this is the equivalent of a big fat deny. So I'm saying within this specific EPG, which is my Army Strong EPG, I never want to allow HTTP traffic to flow. And by applying that taboo contract within that EPG, that's exactly what I'm doing, okay? Because this rule is actually going to be applied in hardware before the regular contracts are even taken into consideration. So again, usually this is for people who haven't fully realized that whitelisting model that we're trying to really achieve within ACI. Okay, so if you know HTTP never needs to get to these servers, but you don't know exactly what else needs to get to those servers, you may have, go back over here, you may have this web EPG, and underneath this guy, in terms of a provided contract, you may be in here saying permit any, right? But you may also know that you never want maybe SSH and HTTP traffic unsecured to get to those groups of endpoints, right? Well, in that point, we would come in and we'd write some sort of taboo contract saying, hey, I'm going to reference HTTP, and I'm also going to reference maybe SSH, and then I'm going to apply this to that EPG. That'll ensure that no HTTP or SSH traffic ever gets to any endpoints in there because, again, these are our denies. This is stuff that we don't want to get to those hosts, okay? And that's how we do that. That's how we do that within here. Until we can get to a point where we can change this permit any, right, which is basically an open filter, to something a little bit more secured, only allowing the services that need to get to those hosts.